Star Trek, the Kobayashi Maru. Chapter 4, How You Play the Game. When the USS Yorktown exploded into a cloud of neutrinos and high-frequency light, Cadet Pavel Chekhov settled back into his auditorium seat and heaved a contented sigh. The 3 Klingon vessels surrounding the Constitution-class starship followed almost immediately afterward, watching the video screen at the front of the lecture hall, an impressive roaring white. The other students in the hall burst into applause, cheering and laughing like the audience in a theater. 4 science cadets in the front row were the only people who looked disgruntled with the proceedings. Chekhov noticed Alan Bosch at the center of that group and smiled. If anyone were going to object to a creative finale, it would be by-the-book Bosch. It was somehow satisfying to know he'd annoyed the other cadets so thoroughly. When the auditorium lights came up, cadets blinked like children just out of sleep. Robert Cecil, the chair next to Chekhov, remarked conversationally, "Kramer's gonna kill you." Chekhov leaned forward over his desk again, watching Cecil brush carbon grime out of his dark blonde hair. Every cadet in the hall was soot-smeared and smelly from the simulator room. Chekhov wondered what his idol, James Kirk, would have thought to see him in such a state of disarray. Chekhov had made no secret of his respect for Kirk, or his confidence that he would be assigned to the Enterprise on graduation. "What can he do?" Chekhov asked the other ensign. "They put me in a simulator and told me to blow up the Klingons, so I blew them up." Cecil snorted and settled back into his own seat. "They told you to function as a starship commander," he pointed out. "I don't think they intended you to blow up your own ship in the process." "Then they should have stressed that before the Klingons arrived." Chekhov knew sacrificing the Yorktown was quite probably a unique response to a tense command scenario, but he still believed the solution feasible. Commodore Aldous Kramer could strut and fume all he wanted. God knew that seemed to be the only justification for the man's existence since Chekhov entered command school. But it wouldn't change what Chekhov had done, and it wouldn't change the fact that they'd been told before entering the simulator that these scenarios were primarily designed to test command character, not rules laid out by command school bureaucrats who had never been in the field. If Kramer didn't like Chekhov's character, the ensign felt that was Kramer's problem. Chekhov certainly wouldn't waste time liking him. Kramer stood now at the foot of the floor-to-ceiling video screen. His hair was color of steel beneath the dismal white overheads. His uninspired eyes, nothing but angry black raisins pushed into the white dough of his face. He said nothing to quiet the cadets, did nothing to attract their attention. Instead, he only exuded haughty displeasure until they ceased to rustle in their seats and their busy chatter died away. It didn't take long. When the lecture hall achieved an acceptable level of order, Kramer stepped neatly to the front of the podium and summoned, "Cadet Chekhov," in a stentorian baritone. Chekhov straightened obediently in his seat. "Sir!" Kramer angled his head to stare up the length of the auditorium at the young cadet. His mouth twisted slightly as if he'd just bitten into a particularly tart lemon. Chekhov recognized the expression as what Kramer paraded as a smile. "I'd feel more comfortable speaking to you if I could see you." Chekhov slid out of his chair before Cecil could surreptitiously nudge him beneath the desk. Cecil apparently feared suffering from the fallout of Kramer's ill humor. If Chekhov didn't leap whenever Kramer commanded, Cecil felt the need to impel him, which frequently led to more embarrassment than Chekhov cared to deal with. While disobedience was not something the young Russian would ever consider, Cecil's impatience had still managed to increase his response time a little. Once Chekhov was standing, Kramer linked hands behind his own broad back and said, "Cadet Chekhov, you have just reviewed the video record of your Kobayashi Maru test, yes?" The words were rounded by a lyric Rhineland accent, the soft tones a sharp contrast to his hard, unimaginative personality. "Yes, sir," Chekhov replied civilly, his own voice accented and firm. "I have." And how would you rate your performance on that test? Chekhov's hesitation was nearly imperceptible. I feel my performance is quite satisfactory, sir. Kramer nodded, pacing the podium with slow, measured strides. A starship captain is sworn to the protection of his ship and crew. Yes? Yes, sir. Chekhov tried to ignore the unease dancing about in his stomach. And a captain is sworn to uphold and defend the peaceful relations we enjoy with our Klingon neighbors, Kramer continued. Yes? The Klingons attacked first, Chekhov interjected. But before the cadet had a chance to protest further, Kramer pulled to a stop an instant and insisted firmly, Answer my question, Mr. Chekhov. The young Russian clenched his fists at his sides and resigned himself to the verbal beating. Yes, he finally returned. He is. Apparently content with that small victory, Kramer folded his hands across the lectern and didn't resume his pacing. You violated the Klingon neutral zone. You engaged 3 Klingon patrol vessels in combat while there was still the potential to retreat. You willfully destroyed a Federation starship worth several billion credits and killed that starship's crew, all to rescue a fuel carrier you cannot prove was indeed in distress at those coordinates. So tell me, what about your performance do you consider so satisfactory? If I may, Commodore, the politeness was stiff and hard-won. Kramer threw his arms wide in mocking invitation. By all means, explain. I'm very interested. Chekhov tried to ignore the smattering of laughter that passed around the hall. He succeeded only partially. It is also a starship captain's duty to protect the rights and lives of the civilians in his area of patrol. That includes civilian fuel transports and their crews. We did inform the Klingons that we were in the area on a non-hostile rescue mission. They offered no such explanation for their own breach of the neutral zone. Just because the Klingons violate the rules, Kramer broke in, does not mean we do. I realize that, sir, Chekhov allowed. I only indicate that any large-scale repercussions are unlikely, as the violation was mutual. Kramer inclined his head, gesturing his consent with one hand. That being the case, he acknowledged, we shall only discuss the possibilities of your posthumous court-martial. There's laughter again, louder this time. Chekhov held his tongue for a count of 3 before continuing. In addition, sir, he went on, I did not kill the Yorktown's crew. You, Kramer interjected, are going to argue that your crew survived because you evacuated the vessel before destroying it, aren't you? The sudden perception caught Chekhov unprepared. He hesitated before he could instruct himself not to. Well, yes, sir. Kramer heaved a sigh so deep Chekhov marveled at the older man's lung capacity. You physically collided a Constitution-class starship with a squad of Klingon cruisers, the Commodore spelled out with painful patience. That means you obliterated 4, do you understand me? 4 antimatter drive vessels, each with a full battery of photon torpedoes and plasma devices. The Federation will be lucky to transmit radio messages through that sector of space in the next 100 years, much less move people through it. Chekhov felt a blush spread from his collar, from the collar of his uniform upward. You didn't think of that, did you, cadet? Lying was not even an option. His face still burning, Chekhov shook his head shortly and said in as firm a voice as he possessed, No, sir, I did not. Of course not. And Kramer took up his notes as if that ended the matter. But if I may, sir. The Commodore paused with his hands full of paper, his head still bent as though studying something astonishing amidst the lecture notes. I still believe that destruction of the Yorktown was a viable alternative to capture, Chekhov pressed when Kramer finally raised his eyes again. Even if the crew was forfeit, sir, retreat was not feasible. The Klingons had already fired upon us, and our warp drive and our weapon systems were inoperative. It's difficult enough to outpilot a Klingon warcruiser. In a functional vessel, Commodore, the Yorktown didn't stand a chance. Kramer, studying him across the distance, didn't interrupt. so Chekhov went on. The possibility of the Yorktown, with or without her crew, being taken by the Klingons also existed. Rather than allow them access to our top-of-the-line designs, I opted for destruction of the vessel. I see, the instructor said coldly, his tone of voice making it clear he did nothing of the kind. The flush burned again in his cheeks, but this time not from embarrassment. I did what I could for the crew, Chekhov insisted. They would have been captured and questioned had any of the Klingon vessels survived. He swallowed hard and considered briefly not finishing his thought. But anger won out over common sense. I've read accounts of what goes on during Klingon torture, Commodore. I believe that my crew would rather have died. No one was laughing now. Kramer's voice, almost too calm to carry across the tall lecture hall, questioned slowly, Are you quite through? Chekhov suddenly wanted very much to sit down and direct attention away from himself again. Yes, sir, that's all. The Commodore rounded the lectern with stiff, short strides. Mr. Chekhov, Kramer said, in a tone as devoid of color as his stare, I will not tolerate another such disruption of this classroom. In the future, if your explanations are required, I will ask for them. Is that clear? Aye, sir. Chekhov held Kramer's gaze with as impassive and hard a stare as he could command. Then his teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. He asked, May I return to my seat, sir? In a tone that sounded more subdued than he liked. You may. Chekhov felt the Commodore's eyes track him as he took his seat. Then, without warning, the Commodore asked, Mr. Chekhov, do you play solitaire? Chekhov heard another meaning in the question, but the sense of it eluded him. I know how, he admitted warily. But no, sir, I don't play. Kramer shook his head. I thought not. His eyes danced away to take in the rest of the class. Chekhov recognized it as a dismissal it was. Would anyone else like to add something regarding Mr. Chekhov's performance? The first volunteer, of course, was Alan Bosch. Will the entire class grade be based on Mr. Chekhov's actions, Commodore? Kramer smiled thinly. Of course, Mr. Bosch. A captain speaks and acts for his entire crew, or had you forgotten? But that isn't fair, Bosch retorted indignantly. I wouldn't have kamikazed the Klingons. The Commodore shrugged. But you also were not the captain. Anyone else? Chekhov had spent enough of his academy time studying up on the Klingons and their war tactics. Too much time to care very much about advice offered from station-bound cadets. Instead, he brooded at the back of the room, arms folded, perhaps too tightly across his chest, and stared at Aldous Kramer, all the while wondering what a disinterest in solitaire had to do with anything. The siren tore Chekhov out of sleep like a cold hand about his heart. On some distant speaker, a woman's voice lilted calm instructions. Chekhov struggled upright in bed, trying to remember if the ship had been on yellow alert when his watch retired. He was still disentangling himself from his bedclothes when the sound of sleepy voices and equipment locker doors penetrated his dream-fuddled panic. Not a red alert siren, but a wake-up call. Suddenly aware that he'd only dreamed about being on board a starship, he heaved a slow, unsteady sigh. Cadet Block G, report to Shuttle Pad 7. Cadet Block G, report to Shuttle Pad 7. Cecil, already stepping into his scarlet and black cadet uniform, grinned at his friend as Chekhov kicked the blankets to the foot of his bunk. Do you know what time it is? Chekhov was still attempting to shake the sleep from his eyes when Cecil supplied. 0400. They're sending us to the shuttle pad at 0400. Here. Chekhov caught the singlet Cecil tossed at him. His hands still shook as he pulled on the uniform and fastened the front. The dream need to race for a starship bridge and report didn't fade, even after they hurried into the corridor that led toward the shuttle pad. They were among the first in G Block to leave the bunkered. I wonder where they're taking us. Cecil didn't interrupt his efforts to finger comb order into his ash-blonde hair, even as he and Chekhov caught up with the 15 women already on their way to the shuttle pad. It could be anywhere, I suppose. That kind of seems the point of being a cadet. Chekhov scanned the people ahead of them for the distinctive flash of Sasha Charles's red-gold hair, spotting her just as Cecil reflected. God, this might even be important, Pavel. Cecil's tone said it was a joke, but the very thought jolted Chekhov into breathlessness, too reminiscent of his earlier anxiety to make light of. Don't worry, he encouraged, for both Cecil's benefit and his own. They'd probably send for real officers if it were. It didn't quiet his reawakened nerves. Sasha Charles glanced back at the sound of their voices. When Chekhov and Cecil both hailed her with waves, she stopped and stepped against the bulkhead to allow the cadets between them to filter by. She slipped into step with them as they approached and fitted an arm possessively around Chekhov's middle. So what gives? We were speculating, Cecil told her, grinning. The current favorite is an atmosphere breach on Luna. A rude noise bespoke Sasha's disbelief. So what's runner-up? When Cecil, for the first time in Chekhov's memory, didn't immediately suggest an alternative, Chekhov stated simply, I think it's Kramer. Sasha briefly cinched her arm tighter about his waist, but didn't reply. It was Cecil who cuffed him on the shoulder and complained, You Russians make me nuts sometimes, you know that? Chekhov pulled away from the other man's swat, swallowing a harsh comment with some difficulty. Cecil's pale eyes glittered in annoyance, both too friendly and too sincere to interrupt. You get a bug up your nose about something, and it's like trying to reason with the rain. Cecil was from Ohio, in North America, and frequently said the most incomprehensible things. What's that supposed to mean? Chekhov demanded. It means Kramer barely knows you exist, Cecil said, but he'd lowered his voice so no one else could overhear. It means not everything he does is some direct reflection of his attitude toward you. I didn't say it was. Chekhov was distinctly ill at ease with this subject. The fact that he couldn't discern if embarrassment or indignation made his face burn only heightened his discomfort. But you can't tell me he doesn't enjoy pointing out my errors. He's trying to make you a better officer. Chekhov scowled. Better than whom? He's an academician. What does he know about being a line officer, besides what he's read in a book? That's your problem. Cecil ducked back against the wall, dragging on Chekhov's elbow, until the other cadet grudgingly halted as well. Chekhov, in turn, caught Sasha's hand when she would have continued, staggering the three of them down the hall at irregular intervals. They're going to be late, he reminded Cecil testily. A dismissive wave was Cecil's only acknowledgement of that fact. Remember I wanted to go look up the service records on our instructors at the beginning of the year? Chekhov nodded. He hadn't seen anything to be gained by Cecil's search at the time and still didn't. I remember. Well, Kramer's got a record as long as your name. He was weapons defense officer on the Farragut for 14 years and assistant to the Starfleet chief administrator for another 7 before he started teaching. Chekhov blanked, honestly surprised. Who would have guessed? I would have, Sasha volunteered. When Chekhov tossed an inquisitive glance in her direction, she shrugged and moved back to stand with them. I just assumed anybody teaching in command school would have to have some experience. Why? Chekhov asked her. 90% of the cadets will never serve on board a starship. The fact that Chekhov confidently maintained that he would get such an assignment, and on the Enterprise no less, had at first earned him jeers and then suspicious looks. That's not all. Cecil caught their attention again, just as the last of their block passed by. Kramer also knows your hero, Kirk. They go way back, as it were. I'll bet he's the one who convinced Kirk to come give that talk last month. A month ago, Chekhov thought Kirk's visit to the academy would be his only chance to meet the man in person, and it took less than half an hour for him to decide he would follow Kirk into hell without question. Thinking that Kirk might know and possibly even like Kramer, butted a stubborn fist of rejection against Chekhov's opinion of his instructor. That can't be correct, was all he said. When Kirk was a lieutenant, Cecil explained, he saved 9 people after a premature weapon detonation that took out most of the Farragut's starboard pod. Kramer is one of those 9. Kramer, recommended Kirk for conspicuous gallantry, and then presented the citation when Starfleet granted it. Sasha nudged Chekhov with her elbow. I'm impressed. You certainly intend to serve with the best. I know. But thinking of Kramer in association with Kirk troubled Chekhov's perceptions of both men. Perhaps that explained the Commodore's hounding. Not jealousy or rancor towards Chekhov, but toward Kirk, with Chekhov the only convenient repository. The realization kindled new anger and frustration, enforcing what he already knew, that he was being treated unfairly. We should hurry. He ended the discussion by nodding down the hall and following his gesture. Whatever Kramer thinks of Captain Kirk or of me won't help us if we're tardy. Chekhov watched a string of emotions chase each other across Cecil's mobile face, but turned away before Cecil could object. A damp, gusty San Francisco wind skated across the bare shuttle pad, weaving sea salt and winter throughout Chekhov's clothes and hair. Waiting beneath the white moonlight was a scarred inter-system shuttle. Kramer stood at the foot of its hatch, a blue-shadowed sculpture with wild, wind-swept gray hair. He nodded vague satisfaction as the cadets assembled before him. As many of you know, the Commodore began, his cool voice in perfect harmony with the seasonal weather, the Aslan Industrial Station has been abandoned for the past 7 months due to bulkhead repairs. Sasha sputtered a laugh, and Cecil gasped, I knew it! In a loud, half-serious whisper. Chekhov hissed him into silence. Aslan does not intend to reclaim the station until after the beginning of the year, Kramer went on. Until that time, the station has been leased to Starfleet for the use of our officers' training school. He smiled thinly. That's you. Cecil made a small, strangled sound. But is there air? He whispered between his teeth. Kramer's smile flickered away, and he darted an icy glare at Cecil and Chekhov. Yes, Mr. Cecil, there is air. Cecil pulled even more severely upright, his eyes locked on the distance in blind embarrassment. I was not assigned to this academy to kill my cadets. I had wondered, Chekhov's mind supplied, against his will. He was rewarded by a wash of mixed humor and resentment and hoped Kramer wouldn't see his expression through the darkness. If the Commodore noticed, he continued without commenting. For the next 3 days, Kramer explained, you'll be involved in a training scenario designed to test your aptitude at individual achievement. He didn't direct his attention toward Chekhov, but the Russian could almost sense the shift of Kramer's thoughts. Something of a 3-dimensional solitaire, if you will. Yourself against yourself. In the Kobayashi Maru scenario, you are a starship commander. In this test, you are simply a Starfleet officer, stranded on a station that has suffered a crippling hull breach at the hands of an assassin committed to killing you. The goal of the scenario is simple. You must stay alive. No one said anything for a time. Then a woman at the front ventured, Sir, who is the assassin? Kramer's smile was somehow particularly aggravating as he sketched an elegant shrug. One of you? It would defeat the purpose to tell you who, as that is a step on your path of discovery as well. I think you will all be surprised. An enigmatic expression softened his entire face for an instant, then vanished so completely Chekhov wasn't sure what he had seen. You will be outfitted with phasers, unalterably set for stun, and transmitters to inform a neutral monitor of when you have been killed. You can also trigger the transmitters if a problem develops. Food can be obtained through the processors on the station, and sleeping and bathroom facilities are available. Kramer paused to smile at Chekhov in paternal condescension. And, Mr. Chekhov, much as it may distress you to learn, destruction of the station is not an acceptable solution to this scenario. So please, endeavor to contain yourself. G-Block dissolved into laughter. Chekhov tilted his chin fractionally higher and stared across the bay at nothing as he waited for the jocularity to die. Are there any further questions? When no one volunteered anything, Kramer called the order to begin unloading and disappeared through the shuttle's hatch. Honest, Cecil murmured as he performed a smooth left face. I don't think he hates you. Humiliation burned at the back of Chekhov's throat. He growled a simple, "Shut up!" before following Cecil inside. So, are you with us? Chekhov glanced away from the viewport at Sasha Charles's whispered question. With you in what? The station thing. She was in the seat directly to Chekhov's left. Her head tipped back against the headrest, and her weapons belt left in a jumble on her lap. Me, Ceci, Westbelt, Cantini, and Guggen are going to try and stick it out together. You know, a cooperative collective. We figured we'd have a better shot at survival that way. Chekhov didn't answer immediately, taking the opportunity to admire the cloud of loose amber hair that framed Sasha's youthful face, the delicate upward tilt of her aquamarine eyes. Well, he'd spent more than just a little time with Sasha since arriving in San Francisco, some of it very private. The prospect of teaming up seemed weak. He wasn't certain he wanted to relinquish his solo status so easily, even for her. I don't know. What's there not to know? Cecil pressed from Sasha's other side. Either we band together and watch each other's asses, or we sit up all night trying to keep from getting killed. He paused to focus a scholarly frown on something in his phaser. It's not a hard decision, he continued, apparently dismissing whatever in the weapon had distracted him. Unless you've got a death wish or something. Chekhov smiled. I don't have a death wish. I'm just aware that none of this will be real. We're supposed to pretend that it is, Sasha pointed out. Chekhov shrugged her qualifier aside. I just don't think we're supposed to band together, he countered, hoping that would end the discussion. Bosch and his cronies are, Sasha argued, and Kramer never said we couldn't. He also didn't say we could. It's a test of individual skill, he said. We're to survive on our own. Cecil shrugged and affixed his phaser to his belt again. So why can't we survive on our own together? A swell of annoyance gnawed at Chekhov, and he turned abruptly back to the viewport. Because I don't need you, he didn't tell them. Because I can score higher on my own. Almost immediately, guilt smothered the flames of those feelings. Chekhov was embarrassed by his lack of faith in his friends, but no less determined. What if one of you is the assassin? They both laughed. If either of us were the assassin, Sasha volunteered, we wouldn't band up with the others. Chekhov looked at her frankly, no laughter in his own dark eyes. And what if I am? Sasha searched his face for something. Even Chekhov wasn't sure what, then pulled away to sink back into her own seat. You aren't, are you? Her voice and eyes were now hooded with uncertainty. Chekhov looked back out the viewport without answering. You wouldn't kill us in our sleep or anything, though, right? Not if you were working with us? It's a scenario, he wanted to say as he watched Earth slide by in marbled blue-green brilliance. No, he sighed finally, I wouldn't. Even that admission seemed weak-willed and unfair. As the shuttle bumped gently against the Aslan station's lock, Sasha caught his face in both hands and kissed him briefly. It was her sign that she didn't hate him for being stubborn, even if he drove her crazy every now and again. Then you're with us? Chekhov tried to keep the displeasure out of his voice. I'm with you. It only increased his annoyance when the others reacted with such thrilled disbelief. Sasha flopped back into her seat, relieved and satisfied. We'll meet at the station's hub, she announced as Kramer began counting off the groups that would exit. This level. You think you can find it? I can find it, Chekhov told her, then added, and you'd better wait for me, even though he half hoped they wouldn't. Sasha smiled and offered him a secretive wink. Always. Kramer made him stay until last. The cadets, armed with nothing but their phasers, disappeared into the station at irregular intervals. Kramer indicated who could leave, apparently at random, sometimes dismissing individuals, sometimes groups as large as 4. Sasha's entourage left in 3 separate migrations. During the next hour and a half, Chekhov entertained himself with speculations as to which of them would make it to the rendezvous. Then experienced a gnawing dissatisfaction that he'd allowed himself to be chained to them for the next 3 days. Cool air from the dimly lit station leaked in through the shuttle's open hatch. Chekhov studied the gray-black repaired Aslan's sloping hide through the shuttle's rear viewport. The chill and the dull half-dark within the station were undoubtedly attempts to simulate the eerie symptoms of a distant hull breach. As always, Chekhov began unconsciously tallying the errors in the fine details of this command scenario. No spaceman's breeze, signed down the empty corridors. No ghost frost hungrily licking the moisture from his lungs. No sirens, no screaming, no distant, desperate cries. No angelic spray of crystal dusting the space just outside a shattered hull. No ice-black eyes crying scarlet from the wrong side of an environmental suit's visor. The images wrenched up memories from news clips he'd seen of a ruptured deep space passenger liner that a starship had tried unsuccessfully to rescue some years ago. That was the real world, he realized suddenly. That's what serving on a starship was really like. Like a bolt of electricity through his insides, Chekhov remembered everything about that frosted panorama in a single blinding instant. He pivoted in his seat until the view of the station was out of sight behind him, no longer interested in criticizing accuracy. Kramer stood guard in the shuttle's empty cockpit. His back was to the twin navigation helm console, his hands resting on the abandoned chairs when he caught up Chekhov's dark gaze with his own. "You think I keep you here as punishment, don't you?" Chekhov stopped himself before turning to look at the station again. "Is this the hubris James Kirk inspires?" the Commodore went on. "The conviction that every environment you inhabit adapts to encompass your needs, your actions, your beliefs?" Chekhov's hands closed on the weapons belt draped across his knees, and he returned Kramer's gaze with grim propriety. "Captain Kirk is a brilliant officer. There isn't a finer commander in Starfleet." Kramer came forward 3 steps, not threatening, but only closing the long distance between them. "I never said he wasn't. I simply question the effect he has on cadets who haven't been around him long enough to counteract his charms." The comment struck deeper than Chekhov liked. He felt the warm coil of anger in his chest that sometimes moved him to say things he shouldn't. Standing, he busied himself with a weapons belt so Kramer couldn't see his eyes. "You wouldn't understand." "Why? Because you don't like me? Because I'm too old?" Chekhov shot a startled look up at his commander, and Kramer snorted. "You may hate me now," he told Chekhov calmly, "but I can guarantee by the end of this weekend you'll hate no one but yourself." Chekhov stared at Kramer without speaking. He experienced a moment's discomfort when a search of the older man's eyes revealed only a dim, painful disappointment, and not the jealous rancor Chekhov expected to see. He looked away to finish fastening his weapons belt. "Should I enter the scenario now, Commodore?" Kramer paused only slightly, then stepped between the narrow seats and waved Chekhov down the aisle. "Go on," he said. "Both of us have wasted enough time." Chekhov estimated Aslan's ambient temperature at just under 15 degrees centigrade, cool enough to chase away a light sweat, as well as make sleeping on the decking a problem. Whether the others would reach the same conclusion couldn't yet be ascertained. Chekhov would have to wait until evening to see which ones tried sleeping wherever they could find cover, and which ones sought out couches and tables in the labs. Aslan's corridors proved not as featureless as Chekhov expected. Works from several artists clung to the sloping walls, and more than one view screen reflected gray distortions of his image as he slipped silently past. Damn Kramer for holding him until the end. If Sasha hadn't conspired to ambush him, surely someone else had thought to lay in wait along this central corridor, if not for him specifically, then merely to eliminate the students forced to travel this route leaving the shuttle. Chekhov trailed one hand nervously along the cool metal hull, wondering where the corridor would branch and how much warning he might have. When the corridor flared ahead, Chekhov noticed the slight whitening of the light long before the opening yawned into view. He eased himself to the floor and belly crawled the last 10 meters. Heat leached through the uniform to disappear into the decking, reminding him that hypothermia would be a very real danger this weekend. Still, he crawled as far as the entrance to the courtyard and continued hugging the floor as he listened for an adversary. No sound filled the alcove but the gentle hum of the kinetic sculpture at the center of the space. The twisted, polished mass of blue-green metal swung slowly on its canted base, strobing the walls with pastel light. Chekhov watched the sculpture turn, trying to decide if the constant movement could provide adequate cover for someone plotting an ambush from one of the courtyard's 3 other exits. He had almost decided it would be more hindrance than help when a pale, blurred face winked at him from one of the sculpture's convex wings. Chekhov held his breath, waiting for the surface to come round again. The smeared reflection sprang into existence just as the sculpture came perpendicular to Chekhov's line of sight. It was halfway up the metal leaf, almost too distorted to be recognizably a face. Chekhov waited through a third slow rotation to be sure. The reflection didn't move. That meant a 4th exit, barely 2 meters to the left of Chekhov's current position, with at least one armed cadet securing it. Chekhov drew both arms up under his chin and studied the sculpture as he considered. It was doubtful the other cadet could see him. The angle was in Chekhov's favor, and the reflection so meaningless Chekhov himself had almost overlooked it. Still, any attempts to move beyond this doorway would doom him, and the sculpture itself prevented a valiant dash for another corridor. He watched the face smear slowly past again. Slowly, carefully, lifting his boots clear of the floor so as not to scrape against the decking, he rotated himself until he lay lengthwise across the wide doorway. Nearly 5 minutes were required to gingerly ease himself up onto his knees, another 3 to silently dog-walk to halfway between his own doorway and the next. All the while, the abstract face winked at him with each passing of the sculpture. His own face had joined it on the bottom quarter of the panel, but the quarry didn't seem to have noticed. That would be his undoing. Still on one knee, Chekhov pressed his left shoulder tight against the bulkhead, held his breath, and raised his arm until he thought it approximated standing level. Then he gripped his phaser tightly and eased it around the corner as though probing ahead before turning. Another phaser flashed into view, also at standing height, and fired. The beam passed above Chekhov's head and spat against the far wall, wasted. Chekhov caught the cadet's wrist with his free hand and knocked the phaser free with a single sharp rap against the bulkhead. He was on his feet and around the corner before the other cadet had a chance to do more than swear. The cadet turned out to be a female, Pamela Spurlock, an engineering command student who'd be spending time as engineer's assistant on an Earth-based station. Chekhov was impressed when the thin, big-eyed woman didn't try to beg for her life. "How'd you know I was here?" she demanded, her voice incredulous and annoyed. "A lucky guess?" Chekhov grinned his apology as he nodded back over his shoulder. "The sculpture!" Then he moved back a step to let her see. Spurlock's mouth twisted with wry displeasure. "Well, that's real close to brilliant. Damn." "Oh, I'm sorry." She shrugged, apparently not holding her failure against him. "Yeah, me too," she sighed congenially. And she brightened. "Oh well, I guess I'll see you when the scenario's over." Chekhov nodded. "I'll see you then." He was just about to stun her when another phaser fired. They both hit the floor together, instinctively seeking a low position, as weapons fired from the 3 surrounding exits. Chekhov didn't even dare raise his head to identify their attackers. "Friends of yours?" he asked Spurlock. She laughed dryly. "Not hardly. I left alone, and they must have left ahead of me. I've killed everybody else that came through here." Another barrage of fire answered Spurlock's comments, followed by Bosch's strident voice. "I know you're with her, Chekhov." Chekhov groaned. "Oh, marvelous." "Get out here and get killed," Bosch continued. "I'm not going to let you louse up my grade again." "He certainly is holding a grudge about this grade average thing," Spurlock commented, apparently not too concerned. You want to blow him away? Chekhov tried to remember if Sasha had mentioned how many people Bosch had recruited, or how many he'd seen leave with Bosch. I think they have us outnumbered, he said at last. There are at least 3 of them. I counted 4 phasers, Spurlock added. Then she smiled and elbowed him playfully. But we're clever. You did a pretty good job with that sculpture, and I had a pretty kick-ass trap set up in the first place. Why don't we try to convince them we're coming around either side of the sculpture, then only round on one? We could clear at least one doorway, I'll bet. Chekhov chewed his lower lip and waited for the latest volley of phaser fire to die. We'll round on the right, he decided finally. Bosch's voice had come from the left. You fire that way, I'll cover this way. He flashed her a smile and added, We'll worry about killing you later. Thanks loads. They fired together, spraying the walls to either side of the sculpture in a futile effort to drive back Bosch's people. The maneuver bought them enough time to dart into the sculpture's cover, then the enemy phaser sounded again. This time, fire was split between the 2 walls. Someone poked his head briefly into view from behind the closest doorway. Spurlock took the man down with a single shot, then shouted, Let's go! Without turning to see if Chekhov followed. Covering their escape with a flurry of rapid shots, he stayed as close to Spurlock as possible. It seemed they'd almost make it, that Bosch would have to wait until later to exact his revenge for Chekhov's destruction of the Yorktown. Then Spurlock staggered, and her phaser skittered ahead of her into the body of the man she'd brought down. Chekhov had run into her before he realized she'd been stunned. Looping one arm around her waist, he only just kept her from falling. She was his shield as he stumbled into the hallway and over the body of the dead man. Easing Spurlock to the ground so she wouldn't hit her head on the decking, Chekhov stunned another of Bosch's cadets when the woman dared a glance around the doorway to verify his presence. Then he heard someone swear violently, followed by the stealthy sounds of retreat. Collecting the fallen man's phaser, Chekhov quickly patted down the other ensign's body. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew he'd found it when the man's stomach clacked. Chekhov rapped his knuckles against the front of the other man's singlet, just to make certain, then carefully undid the front of his uniform. Strapped to the man's abdomen, with 4 strips of surgical tape, was what looked to be a thin plate about 10 centimeters square. Chekhov gently removed the article, refastened the front of the cadet's uniform, and sat back against the wall to examine his prize. After only a few moments of investigation, Chekhov deduced how to unfold the plate into a 4-paneled screen that he recognized as a read-only memory display. The activator ran along the right-hand edge. Caressing the plate with his thumb immediately produced a sharp, intricate schematic on the face of the screen, complete with reference codes and keys. Chekhov smiled, then started to laugh. A map! A circuitry and layout blueprint for the entire Aslan station. He thumbed through the various screens, taking a quick stock of what information the little device made available. Circuit and computer junctions only took up one subcategory. Administrative routing, hub-to-hub referencing, and maintenance access paths were among the others. Chekhov was dizzy with all the advantages this blueprint could give him, not to mention the advantage he'd just stolen from Bosch. No wonder his adversary had been willing to risk another soldier to try and retrieve this body. Bosch wasn't the only one who could seek out and destroy, however. Chekhov intended to make as good a use of this map as Bosch had, probably even better. Referencing the administrative map one last time, he folded the screen to its portable dimensions and fitted it down the front of his own singlet. Then, retrieving the phasers left by Spurlock and Bosch's 2 comrades, he bid Spurlock a grateful farewell and trotted for the closest stairwell. The administrative offices were 7 levels higher than the docking bay. Chekhov traveled the conventional routes long enough to acquire 6 more phasers, then located a maintenance shaft that took him within 2 meters of administration. Pausing at the top of the long climb, he waited for his breathing to steady and the corridor to clear before quietly easing himself back into the battlefield. The door to the administration office was closed, but the jimmied lock was still lodged on the open setting. Inspired by his success with Spurlock, Chekhov approached the doorway on his knees. waiting until the last possible moment to key open the door. As the hatch hissed aside, a wild bolt flashed above Chekhov's head. The young Asian at the administrator's desk had only enough time to bark a frustrated curse before Chekhov's shot caught him full in the chest. Chekhov scurried into the office on all fours, spinning about to close and lock the door before anyone could be attracted by the noise. The mechanism refused to lock. Chekhov jammed it manually. He could always force it open later. The Asian sprawled across the top of the administrator's desk, his face silhouetted against an activated desktop computer screen. Chekhov took the young man's phaser and was just dragging the body out of the chair when he caught sight of the dark yellow screen. Tertiary access accepted. Lockout off. Decode off. Welcome user 293-7244443A. Chekhov nearly dropped his victim. The SOB had broken into Aslan's main computer. Sinking slowly into the chair, he read and reread the screen in awed admiration. Welcome user 293-7244443A. Computer? He finally summoned. He wanted desperately to make use of this opportunity, especially since a break-in was something he could never duplicate on his own. Computer, respond! Nothing. Chekhov ducked under the desk to retrieve the keyboard from where it had fallen during his attack. Fitting it across his knees, he considered for a moment before typing, Voice on. The screen flashed once. Do you wish audio or manual input? AM. Chekhov smiled. An admin computer designed for non-tech users. Deciphering such a helpful system might not be as difficult as he'd feared. He chose the audio function, then addressed the computer again. Good afternoon, user 293-724-443A. A sedate contralto voice replied. How would you prefer to be addressed? Chekhov searched the other man's uniform until he came up with a tech rating card, a stunning tech level 9. Gregory L. Zhao, he told the computer, wondering if he pronounced the name correctly. Please input your identification manually, the computer requested. Chekhov tapped out Zhao's name. Thank you, Gregory L. Zhao. How may I help you? This is it. I'd like to access your main operating system. Main operating system accessed for alteration as of 1827. Good. That meant Zhao had broken all the security and not just the user code. Do you wish to alter my programming? For the space of a heartbeat, Chekhov wondered who would be accountable if he crashed Aslan's system. He was willing to take the blame himself, but doubted Zhao would be pleased to find out how his tech rating was used. Remembering Kramer's face after the mess left in the Kobayashi Maru test chamber, he doubted the Commodore would be pleased either. Chekhov decided it was all part of the risks in the scenario, however, and pushed onward despite the lingering image of Kramer's angry visage. Yes, he told the computer, I'd like to alter your programming. Please present proof of tech rating 4B or higher. He slipped Zhao's card into the reader. The green scanner light flashed, and the computer answered simply, Thank you. Faced with all the options a detailed map and a main computer offered, Chekhov wasn't sure where to start. There had to be a way to meld both advantages, if only by cross-referencing one against the other. Pulling the map out of his uniform, he spread it across the desktop. Computer, do you possess schematics of the Aslan Station's circuitry and layout? Yes, Gregory L. Zhao. Display them, please. The screen shifted, and a series of blueprints identical to those in the map paraded by. Even the grid referencing was the same. Can you scan the number of life forms at... He chose a location at random from his map. Coordinates 273-185-55. I'm sorry, I don't have scanner capabilities. Damn. Chekhov thumbed through the schematics in his map, hoping for inspiration. There seemed to be nothing consistent from map to map. Not even from level to level. The only thing all the displays had in common were red coordinate highlighters at some of the circuit junctions. What is the indicator at coordinates 45-633-33? The red coordinate highlights indicate communication outlets. He frowned. Intercoms? Yes. This had some potential. Can you monitor the intercom channels on Aslan? I can access all forms of communication on the Aslan station. Chekhov clapped his fist into his hand in triumph, then remembered that someone might still be outside the door to hear him. Monitor all intercom outlets, he said more sedately, and report the coordinates of any outlets where you hear activity. A moment of silence followed. Then the screen displayed a long list of coordinates corresponding to the precious map. Chekhov entertained visions of closing off access ways and bulkheads based on the computer's reports, confining groups of cadets for later disposition. It would limit the amount of physical space he would have to cover and would greatly simplify his job. But none of those plans would matter if someone else with an adequate tech rating, like Cecil, broke into the computer and undermined his plans. Thinking of Cecil reminded him that he was supposed to have gone straight to the hub in search of Sasha and the others. A gust of guilt distracted his tactical strategies. He would only be a bit longer, he promised himself, just long enough to verify his suspicions, and to protect his claim on the main operating system. Returning his attention to the amber screen, he queried, "Computer, do you speak Russian?" "Muscovite High Russian, Georgian, or Modern?" "Modern. I speak Modern Russian at a level 15 fluency." Chekhov folded the map and sat back with a smile. "As of this override, reconfigure your communication system to send and receive exclusively in Modern Russian. All other accesses should be denied." "As you wish, Grigory Eljao. Please wait." Almost immediately, the complex schematic leapt away from the screen, replaced by the message prompts that had originally greeted Chekhov, only this time the prompts were in Cyrillic. "Pokonchil." Chekhov smiled and switched off the screen. "Prexraneya," he replied softly. "Excellent." Despite the thundering white noise of Aslan's sleeping generator, the hub was maddeningly quiet. The rumbling was a soothing subliminal presence coursing like a heartbeat through a great ship's deck, palpable everywhere you stood. It was a vibrant, vital sound, as deep as the earth. It meant the ship and her crew were cared for and alive. Chekhov paused to place one hand on the hub's outermost door. If he'd realized the decibel level behind these doors, he wouldn't have instructed the computer to lock the exits. On his way to the hub, it occurred to him that Sasha and Cecil might grow impatient with his tardiness and desert him as a casualty. He ordered the computer to eavesdrop on the area. It reported no success at discerning human activity. He didn't consider that the computer's failure might be because of other noise. He'd sealed the bulkheads because he didn't want the others to leave him behind. No, because he didn't want them to think he had failed. The admission embarrassed him a little, but he would rather they thought he'd abandoned them than know they thought him incapable of joining. Thumbing the intercom by the huge double door, he leaned close and intoned in Russian, "Computer? Da, Grigory Eljao." Hearing the machine answer in Russian still made him smile. Using the same language, he replied, "Open bulkheads at my coordinates." The computer complied. Sound poured out at him in a frothing white gale. Chekhov stepped through the doors to approach the singing machinery with care. Crannies and cubbyholes littered the ragged room. He couldn't even hear his own breathing above the generator. He only knew the outside door had closed when the ambient light in the room dimmed by half. Sasha and the others were nowhere to be seen. Pausing by his shunting engine, he eased one of the phaser power packs off his belt and tossed it toward the middle of the room. It clattered against the gray decking, then lay still. "You're late," Chekhov wheeled, phaser drawn. Sasha scowled at the weapon as she stepped from behind the loud generator. Cantini and Guggen peeked out after her, but didn't venture forth. All three cadets were bug-headed with noise-reducing headsets. "Where the hell were you?" Sasha demanded at the top of her lungs, pushing Chekhov's phaser away from her with one hand. Chekhov returned the weapon to his belt. I was attempting to be surreptitious. She frowned irritably and tapped at her headset. Chekhov threw his hands up to indicate that he had no suggestions for better communication. Then he tugged his belt about to let her see the phaser packs there. She adjusted her headset but didn't smile. It's better than collecting scalps, I guess. Chekhov chose not to hear the comment. Sasha led him around the generator assembly, motioning for Gugin and Cantini to join them. Cantina. They startled Cecil and Westbeld at the back entrance and were nearly shot for it. Once everyone was calmed again, Sasha pushed them into the numbing quiet of the corridor beyond. I was hoping you would wait, Chekhov said when Sasha removed her headset and rubbed at her ears. I was detained. We didn't have a choice. Cecil massaged his own scalp with one hand, twirling the headset on the fingers of the other. Somebody jammed the doors. We tried to leave almost an hour ago. Chekhov considered explaining the predicament, but decided against it. Well, I'm here now. We should probably get going before someone finds us in the hallway. Westbelt laughed once, sourly. Where are we going to go? She wanted to know. What's wrong with just staying here? It isn't secure enough, Chekhov informed her, and it's too loud. We'd never sleep. But nobody can ambush us here, Sasha pointed out. The entrances are easy to guard from the inside, and we've got the headsets. She presented hers to him, as though he hadn't noticed them before now. Chekhov pushed the headset back at her. There are other defensible places, most of them with better acoustics. Only Cecil looked interested, such as the administrative offices. Even half deafened by the generator, Chekhov heard Sasha's low laugh. Sure, us and everybody else in this man's army. Pavel, that's the first place everybody will head. Chekhov flashed her a smug grin. Of course it is, but I've been there already, and I booby-trapped the doors so only I can get back in. The other five stared at him. Westbelt grinned with delight, but the others only toyed with their weapons or headsets and said nothing. Is that legal? Gugin finally ventured. Chekhov tried to mask his annoyance. Is it illegal? He returned. They told us that we could do anything, so long as we survived. I had spare phasers from 3 other people I took out of the scenario. He knew now that not mentioning his relationship with the computer had been a wise decision. Securing administration seemed a prudent course of action, he finished. Yeah, Cantini sighed. I suppose so. Gugin finally shrugged and tossed her headset back into the supply cabinet by the door. If you've got it secured already, I guess we may as well use it. Anybody else mind? No one voiced an objection. Chekhov plucked Gugin's headset out of the cabinet, holding a hand out to stop Cecil from depositing his headset as well. Take it, Chekhov insisted, then looking about at the others. Take all of them. Let anyone else who comes here have to fight the noise. Cecil sighed roughly in frustration. Why? It'll distract them, Cantini explained, nodding at the headset in his hands. They'll be easier for somebody else to pick off. He grinned at Chekhov. Good plan. Chekhov smiled in reply. Sasha fidgeted with her headset. What does making somebody else miserable gain us? She asked. I mean, why do we care? Chekhov shrugged. If someone else stuns them, that's better odds for us. Everyone but Sasha took the headsets. Chekhov hesitated only briefly, then picked up hers without comment. Simulated twilight tugged the already inadequate lighting into cold, warped shadows along the reflective floors and walls. Distant phaser fire startled Chekhov more than once, pricking him to the alertness of prey for the first time in the scenario. The deck seemed shot through with electricity, making each step both dreadful and exhilarating. He was glad when they finally reached the admin offices. Zhao's body was gone, but a Siluri cadet sprawled in the hallway in almost the same position as Chekhov had left Zhao. He tossed a victorious smile over his shoulder at Sasha as he eased up to the door. She glanced at the Siluri and didn't smile back. Chekhov snapped a protectable probe off the clip on his belt and extended it toward the door. What are you doing? Cecil whispered in his ear. Chekhov glanced back at his friend, then returned to his work. "I'm unboobying the trap," he explained, glad for the distraction after Sasha's obvious displeasure. "Keep everyone away from the door." The probe was just under a meter in length at its greatest extension. Chekhov pressed flat against the bulkhead, placing his feet uncomfortably close together along the wall, and flicked the probe across the sensor governing the access. The door sighed open, and a short triplicate burst of phaser fire sparked against the far wall. Chekhov kicked forward with one foot, propping the door open with his toe, and waited for the barrage to cease. "It would be easier," Cecil suggested after Chekhov had crossed the threshold to maintain the opening for the others, "to just jam the lock." Chekhov tried for an air of nonchalance as he shrugged the suggestion aside. "I'm not a tech," he rationalized. "I'd probably be unable to open it again." In reality, he'd simply thought the trap a better way to stop Bosch in case the other cadets should follow him here. Cantini flopped onto a wall-length divan. "Well, it's going to be more comfortable than the generator room." He crossed his arms behind his head with a contented sigh. As though creature comforts were all that matters to life. Sasha clapped her phaser down on a desktop, then waved off Gudin when the other woman started to speak. Chekhov watched as Sasha paced to the other end of the room and stared at the wall. "Hey, Pavel?" Chekhov turned to find Cecil bending over the desk that housed the computer terminal. Cocking his head as though trying to read something written there, Cecil asked, "Is this a mainframe terminal?" "It's down." Cecil frowned at him, and Chekhov hoped the answer hadn't come too quickly. "I tried it earlier," Chekhov elaborated with a shrug. "The ready screen wouldn't even come up. I guess they've deactivated the system." Cecil made a face Chekhov couldn't interpret at the blank screen. "I guess." "I'm hungry," Cantini announced abruptly. "Anybody else want to scare up some food?" Westbelt raised her hand from where she sat in a desk chair across the room. "I will. I haven't eaten since breakfast." "See if you can find a rec hall," Sasha instructed without turning around. "They'll have food service there." "And be careful of traps," Cecil added. Chekhov shot a startled look at the computer tech, but didn't comment. "You can't be the only one to have thought of it," Cecil pointed out, sinking into the desk chair. "We should all be careful." "More careful than you know," Chekhov thought, turning back to the others. Whether another cadet practiced trapping or not, Chekhov had rigged most of the food processors and bathrooms between the administrative offices and the hub. Bathrooms and commissaries were the only two places that everyone eventually had to visit. "There's a food service station down that way about 400 meters, Chekhov informed them, pointing. "I think it's the closest." It was also the one he left unsabotaged for his own use. Both cadets nodded understanding before ducking out the door. Chekhov used Westbelt and Cantini's departure to instruct Cecil and Gudin in how to deactivate the door. Sasha, now seated, watched them without interrupting, her displeasure painfully apparent. Chekhov was suddenly sorry that they were even involved in this scenario. Sorry he'd kept quiet about his involvement with the computer. Sorry about his surreptitious bombings. Mostly he was sorry that this apparently mattered so much to Sasha when it was little more than an elaborate game to him. Her state of pique annoyed him, but he didn't want to alienate her over something that was barely real. Leaving Cecil to modify the booby trap, Chekhov went to sit on the edge of the desk next to Sasha. When she didn't talk to him for a full minute, he asked, "Are you angry with me?" "I don't want to talk about it here." But her eyes said something different, something furious. Chekhov tugged her to her feet. "There's another office," he said, nodding toward the door at the back of the room. "Let's talk in there." Cecil looked up in query as they passed. Chekhov conveyed his uncertainty with a hopeless shrug, then followed Sasha into the next room. She crossed to the long, lacquered desk dominating the far wall and picked up an amorphous ornament in one hand, just to toss it into the other. Chekhov watched her fluid movements with attached fascination. Sasha was trained in more forms of bare-handed combat than he even knew names for. She could probably kill a Barbar, Yote assassin 100 times over with that paperweight alone before the assassin even knew security was in the room. Well, perhaps she wasn't quite that fast, but she was talented and tempered by a family tradition of martial arts. Chekhov had never known her to be timid or circumspect in any aspect of their relationship, professional or personal. She didn't disappoint him now. "You've turned into a regular Bobbin the Butcher, haven't you?" Chekhov crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means I saw your face in there. It means you booby-trapped the food service centers, probably most of the lifts, and maybe even some of the sleeping quarters." She returned the paperweight to the desk with a startling clunk. "Remember the parameters of the scenario?" Chekhov asked. "We're at war. So you turn guerrilla." The accusation stung more than he'd expected. "I turned practical. We don't know who the assassin is. We don't know what he or she is capable of. If this were real life, you wouldn't be complaining." She shook her head slowly. "Don't be so sure of that, mister." Chekhov searched her pale eyes for some sign of uncertainty or weakness, but found none. Finally, he turned away with a frustrated sigh. "You don't understand. And don't patronize me. I'm not a child. Then you should know that sometimes the good guys get ugly too," he shouted in return. "But when does it stop? When do we stop fighting fire with fire and decide not to take the easy way out by just killing all our competition? That's not what Starfleet is about, and you know it." "It's a scenario, Sasha," he insisted, resigned to lose this fight, no matter what he said. "It's like the Kobayashi Maru. It isn't real. They're testing our reactions and resourcefulness, not our morality. Whether we're supposed to admit it or not, everyone knows that no one dies. I know that. You know that. That means we're all going to behave differently than we would in real life." Her jaw muscles twitched as she fingered the paperweight, but she wouldn't look up at him. Taking her chin in one hand, Chekhov tipped her eyes into the light and said gently, "Sasha, in real life, I wouldn't blow up my own starship just to spite the Klingons." She pulled her chin out of his hand and dropped her gaze once again. "I wonder, Pavel," she said very softly. "Sometimes I just wonder." "Sasha, I just wish I knew what we were being tested for." Her voice betrayed something between frustration and anger, but she didn't object when Chekhov moved closer to slip an arm around her waist. "It's like the Kobayashi Maru. They don't run that test just to find out how long it takes a Klingon warfleet to kick our butts. They run it to find out who gives up, who goes down fighting, who never notices that the battle's over. They want to know everything about us." She sighed, a soft, hollow sound that seemed to echo some insecurity Chekhov didn't share. "If I knew what they really wanted," she admitted finally, "I'd feel a lot better about this." "They want us to be strong," Chekhov told her, wishing he could grant her his belief. "Whatever we do, whatever their reasons, they want us to prove that we can deal with anything Starfleet might ask of us. That means we do our best to win, even when our best makes us seem cruel or hard." She laughed once and looked at him. "It's the fact that you're so sure you know that what winning means," she told him baldly. "It's the fact that you think it's so easy that has me worried most. I think you'll find that you're selling yourself and Starfleet short." Chekhov awoke the next morning to the sound of phaser fire and shouting. Sasha, stretched out beside him on the inner office's only sofa, rolled to her feet with silent grace, her eyes trained cat-like on the outside door. Recognizing the voices, Chekhov caught her by the shoulder and hissed, "It's Bosch! Lock the door!" Sasha darted across the room to slap at the door control, twisting the locking mechanism until the status light flashed from green to red. In the office beyond, Cecil's voice could be heard above the others, shouting at Cantini to move something into a more defensible position. Chekhov could barely make out the words and suspected the specifics didn't matter much anyway. Swearing under his breath, he pulled Sasha away from the door toward the desk on the other end of the room. "We should go out to them," she insisted in a hoarse stage whisper. They're going to get slaughtered. Chekhov's mind still chased itself about, trying to figure out how someone had survived long enough to get past his protection on the door. We can't help them. We should die trying. He almost laughed aloud. And prove what? That we aren't any more serious about this scenario than anyone else on this station? Besides, he had no desire to grant Bosch his wish by giving himself over to an easy kill. A phaser bolt landed on the closed door, making the steel and plastic sing. Chekhov herded Sasha toward the hollow under the desk as he cast about the room for some escape. She caught the desktop with one hand and refused to be pushed under. They're our friends, she insisted. We can't just leave them out there. Yes, we can. A ventilation grate on the wall above the sofa was the only avenue of escape, not involving a rush through the forces outside. Chekhov knew from his pilfered map just how erratic and treacherous the ventilation shafts could be. Nothing short of impending death of a very real and excruciating nature could inspire him to dare those steep and winding passages. You keep insisting that this isn't like real life. Sasha, still standing, looked back and forth across the room as well. Just keep in mind that everybody will be alive in the real life following this scenario, and they're all going to be really ticked off at us. She hefted the paperweight in one hand. Use this, she said, handing it across the desk to Chekhov. You can knock out the grate, then we can hide under here. They'll think we went through the ventilation system, and we can vacate the offices after they're gone. Chekhov smiled as he took the weight. You're better at this than you like to admit. I don't believe in doing things by halves. Each of the clips on the ventilation grate shattered after only a single blow. Chekhov broke 3 of them, leaving the grating askew, as though he and Sasha had tried to pull the grate back into place during their hasty departure. The paperweight he left on the sofa. The hollow beneath the black and silver desk was never designed to conceal 2 Starfleet cadets. They only fit in the space after 3 minutes of thoroughly embarrassing rearrangement, and that was only when they sat hip to hip with their knees in their own ears. Sasha had just adjusted the castered chair across the opening when the door between the 2 officers blew. Chekhov held his breath as light footsteps crossed the room just beyond the desk's outer wall. Every muscle in his legs was suddenly cramped and aching, the need to move almost unbearable as he listened to the intruder step up on the couch and lift away the broken grating. He saw Sasha raise a hand to cover her mouth. Her jaw clenched and her eyes closed. Apparently, he wasn't alone in his discomfort. Damn. The voice, soft and muffled, was swallowed almost to nonsense by the ventilation duct. Then the footsteps recrossed the office and were gone. Sasha exhaled loudly. Can I move now? She whispered. Chekhov shook his head. Wait a little longer, he whispered in return. Make sure they're gone. They waited for nearly an hour. The cramps in Chekhov's legs were very real by now. He felt dizzy from their constricted positions. Still, it wasn't until he heard a cleanup crew in the office outside that he deemed it safe to exit. Sasha fell onto her side in exaggerated agony, pushing the chair away with enough force to bounce it off the wall. I'm crippled for life. I'll never walk again. Chekhov crawled out behind her, pleased to hear Sasha's laughter again after her earlier ill humor. He nodded toward the door. Is the cleanup crew gone? She stumbled to her feet and half ran, half limped to the exit. Holding herself off to one side as she keyed open the door, she darted a quick look into the other room. Yeah, she confirmed with a nod. All clear. Good. Chekhov terminated his stretching when he felt something twinge in his shoulder. I may never recover from this. I'm not going to live to recover if I don't get to a bathroom. Sasha glanced into the outer office again. Pavel, I'm headed for the ladies' room down the hall. Wait for me. He nodded, still working at his stiff shoulder. Don't take too long. I want to get food too. I'll hurry, she promised. Then she slipped into the next room and disappeared. Chekhov gave her a moment to make it some distance down the hall, then headed into the outer office himself. Nothing of the ambush remained. Even the 3 phasers Chekhov had used in the booby trap had been taken by the cleanup crew. He tried not to let their loss annoy him. He could always obtain more. The desktop computer screen was still dark. Chekhov paused on the side of the desk closest to the outside door. wanting to hear Sasha's return in time to terminate the conversation, and powered up the mechanism. "Computer," he summoned in quiet Russian. "Good morning, Gregory Elzhao," the computer replied. "Please monitor all intercom outlets and report coordinates where you detect activity." "Yes, Gregory Elzhao." Chekhov glanced into the hall for Sasha. There's no sign of anyone in any direction. He ducked back into the office, prepared to wait yet for the computer's response, and was surprised when it greeted him with, "Two beings detected at coordinates 456-779-340. 4 beings detected at 55-56-47. Chekhov waited for it to continue. When it didn't, he pressed, "Are there any others?" "Only yourself, at coordinates 147-90-423. Do you wish me to reassess my findings?" No, computer, that's fine." He unfolded the map across the top of the desk. The computer's reported coordinates were several floors apart, both sets quite a distance from his present location. If he and Sasha were survived by only 6 other students, he could only hope the group of 4 was Bosch's squad. Tracing a finger along several of the deck plans, he memorized the quickest route between the admin offices and the smaller of the 2 groups, all the while conscious that Sasha would rejoin him soon. He wasn't certain how she'd respond to discovering his relationship with the computer, but he knew he was going to tell her. The computer offered too many advantages to just abandon it now that the scenario was so close to ending. Besides, having Sasha as a co-victor didn't feel as much like a compromise as he'd expected. "Computer, isolate floors 1 through 7 and decks 20, 22. In the distance, hollow rumblings heralded the descent of the ponderous bulkhead doors. Chekhov left open only a 2-deck span on either side of both parties, enough to give them the illusion of freedom, if they chose to migrate. He would worry about confining them further when he and Sasha drew near the sites. "Will that be all, Gregory Elzhao?" He nodded as he closed the map, then realized the gesture was lost on the computer. "Yes, computer, thank you." "You're welcome." Smiling at the incongruity of technological courtesy, he leaned over the desk to switch off the screen. Outside, the hallway was still silent and empty. Chekhov trotted down the open corridor without bothering to draw his phaser. He knew the locations of everyone still alive on the station. There was no one to defend himself against on this level, as no one was functional here besides him. That thought carried with it a cold shudder of realization. He slowed his gait to a hesitant walk. No one. The computer reported no activity on this level except for Chekhov in the admin office. That meant Sasha had either departed the level or was no longer active. He had a feeling he knew which it was. Dropping to his knees, he dug down the front of his singlet for the map, balancing it on one hand as he flipped the panels apart with the other. The admin level flashed onto the screen, littered with the cobalt blue indicators he'd been setting to highlight his own trap locations. 50 meters down the hall from the admin office, the women's restroom was littered with flashing blue. Chekhov groaned and buried his face against the map. He was a dead man, even if Robert and the others never learned that he'd set traps all about the Aslan station. Sasha had already divined the fact. She would know who booby-trapped the bathroom, and she would kill him. He scrambled to his feet and ran the last few meters to the bathroom. The door slid aside at the slightest touch. Inside was as silent as the hallway. "Sasha!" Unlike admin, he hadn't planned on re-entering any of the booby-trapped bathrooms, and so had left no options for bypassing the traps. The phasers fired as soon as someone rounded the first bend in the room. Chekhov stayed carefully in the doorway and called her name again. He retreated to an intercom panel once he was convinced even Sasha wouldn't keep silent so long for the sake of a joke. Thumbing the audio switch, he summoned the computer with a listless sigh. "Monitor all intercom outlets and report coordinates where you detect activity." The same groups appeared, 2 and 4. Only the 2-person group had relocated by a deck. The 4-person party still kept to the library. "Close down the bulkheads to the 19th floor," he said. "If the 2 people at coordinates 425-457-77 move outside the room they currently occupy, seal that room behind them." "As you wish, Gregory Elzhao." He headed for a lift without thanking the computer. Less than 18 hours into the scenario, he planned to finish it before the 24-hour mark arrived. If only he could reach Deck 19 before his quarry found some way to bypass the bulkheads. First, he'd have to stop by the engineering storeroom where he'd pilfered his first collection of timers and triggering devices. He still had 7 phasers with which to construct a little insurance. The 2 on the 19th floor were annoyingly easy to dispatch. Chekhov found them arguing in the hallway outside one of the bulwarked rooms, each apparently blaming the other for having locked the door on their way out. Chekhov stunned them before they even knew he was there. He sat on the floor while the cleanup crew came for the bodies, meticulously wiring phasers into a series and affixing them to his belt. One of the cleanup technicians peered at him curiously while lifting a body onto a stretcher. "What are you making? A toy train?" Chekhov didn't look up from his work. "Hey, bomb!" "Ah!" The tech nodded sagely at his companion. "Starfleet's finest," he assured the woman with him. They both giggled as they wheeled the litters away. Chekhov ignored their laughter. He'd told Sasha he wouldn't sacrifice an entire Federation starship just to spite the Klingon Empire, and he still believed that was true. He also believed it was his duty as an officer to make his own death or capture too expensive a goal to be worth the enemy's efforts. In the real world, that might not mean the destruction of a fully crewed Constitution-class starship, but it could mean voluntary death in the face of inevitable defeat, death that carried the price of many lives other than his own. Bosch, no doubt, would miss the irony in the gesture, but it wasn't intended as revenge against the other cadet. Not entirely, at least. Chekhov tucked the last phaser into the array, then set about secreting the multicolored wires out of sight behind his belt. With the whole apparatus cinched about his waist again, it looked like nothing more than an equipment belt crowded with a half-dozen extra phasers. Only Chekhov knew about the wire threaded down the left sleeve of his singlet, or about the wire loop near his ring finger that he could tug with almost no effort at all. No one else would see the tiny Rube Goldberg that would trigger the first phaser on his belt at almost the same moment it fired the second and the third. Chekhov fingered the wire peeking out of his sleeve. "Boom," he murmured to himself. In real life, the enemy would no doubt have circuit detectors or personnel trained in search and remove, but, as Sasha had so testily reminded him, this wasn't real life. Nor was this real death. It was all a test to which someone else had constructed the rules, but which Chekhov didn't intend to lose, even if all he could do was assure no one else won it either. The door to the library was locked. Chekhov frowned at the sealed bulkhead, toying with the loop of wire that brushed against his wrist, and trying to decide why something as prudent as a locked door should make his spine tingle and his muscles ache, as though he were guiding a starship into battle. True, he hadn't instructed the computer to seal this bulkhead. He'd cordoned off the rest of the deck, half hoping this group would show a bit more initiative than the last. They hadn't even left the library, though, and now he discovered the door locked from the inside without even a guard placed in the hall. He wondered if Bosch were somehow aware that Chekhov was the only one left they had to face, if he were waiting just on the inside for the Russian to override their lock. When Chekhov entered, Bosch would shoot him. Growling low in frustration, Chekhov backed away from the door. If there were only some way to force them out, to be more sure where they were, what they were doing. He remembered an intercom only a few meters down the corridor and trotted back to it while still considering his plan. "Computer!" A longer pause than he expected then. "Yes, Gregory Eljau." "Can you still verify 4 life forms in the library?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, Gregory Eljau." "Can you pinpoint their locations within the library?" "I'm sorry, Gregory Eljau, but my audio monitors are not designed for that level of accuracy." Chekhov drummed his fingers against the wall, his thoughts chasing each other round and round like angry birds. If he knew where they were, if he knew what they were doing, if, computer, he continued, wrestling his thoughts under control, long enough to choose a course of action. "Can you override the manual lock on the library door?" "Of course, Gregory Eljau, My system is... An infinitesimal pause in the middle of its answer this time. Chekhov wasn't sure why, but the quirk worried him. Designed for convenient use by administrative personnel. Would you like me to perform such an override now? Yes! This time the heartbeat of silence was acceptable. Then the indicator light, a dozen steps down the hall, moved silently from red to green, and the computer announced simply, "Done." Chekhov relocated the wire loop in his sleeve, tucking it further out of sight as he returned to the library door. He shadowed the wall during his approach, triggering the door sensors at the last possible moment. The breathless hiss as the door whisked aside seemed almost too loud to bear. The inside of the library was dark and cavernous, floor-to-ceiling displays, paneled-off alcoves where terminals sprouted from the tops of long tables. A maze of shelves housing a dusty, woody-smelling collection of antique printed paper books, zigged and zagged across the first few meters in front of the door. Chekhov crouched lower than the tallest shelving unit and eased his own phaser into his hand. Well-remembered voices drifted to him from across the abandoned terminals. "Yard looked a lot bigger once we took down the bushes." "What'd you replace them with?" Laurel Gugin wanted to know, sounding more interested in the subject than Chekhov would have given her credit for. "Anne wanted to plant more shrubs," Westbeld replied, "but I talked her into shade flowers and meadow stuff. Actually, she wanted azaleas, too." Chekhov sank back on his heels, suddenly hesitant. Westbeld and Guggen? Here? Had Bosch taken the women prisoner, or had the two groups somehow banded together? Where were Cantini and Cecil? Other sounds came from all over the room, footsteps, dragging and repetitive like those of a captured lion pacing its habitat from boredom. His own breathing coming back to him, double loud from the bookshelves to his right and left, the spasmodic click-clacking of a terminal keyboard, an occasional muffled curse. "Robert!" Chekhov clenched his teeth against a string of angry words as his thoughts leapt up into turmoil again. Robert, the computer expert. Robert, who was, no doubt, within coding distance of discovering why the computer wasn't as cooperative as it should be. Robert, who had apparently defeated Bosch's squadron after all, then left Chekhov and Sasha for dead. Robert, his Achilles heel. Chekhov decided he'd have to shoot Robert first. "Where the hell have you been?" The sharp prod of a phaser in the small of his back, not Cantini's voice, stopped him from continuing forward. "Don't shoot me," Chekhov said, trying to hide his annoyance at being caught. "I'm on your side." Cantini didn't appear to be impressed. "Answer my question," he growled as Chekhov turned to face him. "Where have you been?" Chekhov heard Westbelt and Guggen's conversation stagger into non-existence at the sound of Cantini's voice. "I've been anywhere I could get to," Chekhov told Cantini simply. "There aren't many open routes through the station, though. Someone's been locking the doors." "We noticed," Guggen volunteered, as she and Westbelt approached their position. They, at least, hadn't drawn their phasers, even if Cantini refused to put his away. Al tried to leave this level about an hour ago, but he couldn't find an access that would open. "So where have you been?" Chekhov turned back to Cantini. The smaller man's dark eyes glittered in his round, flat-featured face, somehow accusing Chekhov of something too unspecific to state out loud. Chekhov wondered how much Cantini had guessed. "What do you want me to tell you?" he asked. "I've been confined to this damn station just like you, trying to keep myself from getting stunned, just like you." The anger in Cantini's eyes faltered momentarily. "We left you with Sasha in the admin offices. You ran away when we were attacked. You didn't even come out to help us." "We didn't think there was anything we could do," Chekhov told him. "By the time we realized what was happening, we thought you'd already been taken out." Cantini snorted. "So you ran." Better to repeat a lie they already believed than to muddy the waters with the truth. "Yes," Chekhov told him, "we ran." When Cantini would have said something more, Westbeld interrupted. "So where's Sasha?" "Out of the scenario," Chekhov answered. The mention of her name and the thought of how angry she would be when he saw her next made his face burn. "We were surprised by 2 other cadets on the 19th floor." The lies seemed to come awfully easy now. Keyboard clatter attracted his attention again. He tried to look past the shelving unit between himself and Westbelt, but couldn't see beyond her shoulder. "Where's Robert?" he asked, as casually as he could. Guggen glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting to see someone there. When there was nothing, she turned back to Chekhov with a shrug. "With the computer, doing something." Chekhov fingered the wire up his sleeve. "Do you know what he's doing?" "Does it matter?" Cantini demanded acidly. Chekhov only glanced at him. He knew enough. "He's trying to break in," Guggen volunteered. She was the first to turn back toward the room, obviously losing interest now that their prowler proved to be friend rather than foe. "He thinks the locked bulkheads may have been arranged through the mainframe." Chekhov, still under Cantini's watchful eye, stood to follow the women further into the room. "How long has he been working?" Westbelt settled back into one of the stiff, unpadded seats. "About 3 hours. He says he almost got it once or twice, but he keeps denying his communications protocol, even in binary." Chekhov nodded vacantly and played with his wire. Cantini poked the other ensign in the ribs with his phaser, startling a sharp profanity out of him. "What's the matter?" Cantini asked shrewdly. "You don't look like you think it's a good idea." "It's just—" Chekhov made himself stop fingering the trigger wire. "What if he disrupts something? This is a civilian station. They might not take well to having their data corrupted." "He knows what he's doing," Guggen said without concern. She turned on a reader by her left hand. "Besides, somebody else already broke in once. What more harm can Ceci do?" If only they knew. "Damn it!" Only Chekhov jumped at Cecil's sharp invective. The others were no doubt inured to his outburst by now. Pulling away from the table, Chekhov started in the direction of his friend's voice, ignoring Cantini's belligerent, "Don't you go anywhere, Chekhov." Cecil crouched over an active terminal, his eyes washed copper by the steady amber light. He didn't look up as Chekhov approached, didn't even glance away from whatever his eyes tracked across the tilted screen when Chekhov paused at the rear of the monitor to stare at him. "Robert? Don't bother me," Cecil muttered distractedly. "I'm busy." "I'll bet you are." "What are you doing?" Chekhov pressed. "This isn't our equipment." Cecil growled inarticulately and punched a series of buttons. "Yeah, well, tell that to the Tech-9 who cracked the system." He slapped his hands against his thighs in a fit of frustration. Cantini materialized at Chekhov's shoulder. "Leave him the hell alone," he grumbled, tugging at Chekhov's elbow. "I'm still not convinced you're not Kramer's assassin, so just—" Chekhov jerked his arm away just as Cecil exclaimed, "Pavel!" and Westbelt and Guggen ran up to join them. "What's going on? Did you get in?" "Welcome, user 128641937F." Chekhov grabbed the terminal and spun it about before Cecil could respond. "Computer!" he shouted. "Слушайте! Открытие!" The terminal went dead. No one said anything for a moment. Then Cantini caught Chekhov by the back of the neck and spun him roughly about. "Why, you son of a—" Chekhov struck the other man's hand away, ducking out of range, as Cantini drew back to swing at him. Remember the beginning of the scenario?" he cautioned. "They told us anything goes." Westbelt had unlimbered her own phaser, but didn't look as though she knew what she wanted to do with it. "You aren't a Tech-9, Cecil argued. He still looked vaguely puzzled, not even capable of anger in his confusion. "I've seen you work, damn it! You didn't break into this system." Chekhov half turned to Cecil, glad for the distraction. "I didn't," he admitted. "I took it from the Tech-9 who did." Cecil shook his head slowly. "How?" "Who cares how?" Cantini interjected. "He screwed us, Bob. He agreed to work with us, and then he screwed us over." He swung an angry glare on Chekhov again. "Did you set up that ambush too? How did you really kill Sasha?" "I didn't," Chekhov shot back, furious at the suggestion. "We really thought you were gone. Sasha and I wanted to help you." "Well, a fat lot of help you turn out to be." Westbelt pursed her lips and combed her hair out of her eyes with one hand. Looking at Cecil, she stated, "I say we kill him." Cecil still stared at the blank screen, occasionally punching a button on the keyboard as though expecting some reply. "I can't believe this." "We're going to kill him, Bob," Cantini said a bit more loudly. "It's 3-1 unless you want to help." Laurel didn't vote, Chekhov started to point out, but Guggen added, I want to kill you too, before he even finished his sentence. Chekhov threw up his arms in exasperation. You don't understand! I understand enough, Cecil said quietly, evenly, to know that we six agreed to work as a team. He looked up from the keyboard, his blue eyes hard and bright as ice. Why didn't you respect that? Why didn't you tell us about the computer or the traps? What game are we supposed to be playing here? Chekhov sighed. That's your problem, he said. This isn't just a game. It was a figure of speech, Cecil began. But Chekhov cut him off. It's more than that. Every step of the way, you've been treating this like real life, as if we were all really in danger of being killed by some desperate situation. But it's a command scenario, and the only scores any of us are getting will be on our records for the rest of our lives. He looked from Cecil's frustrated face to Cantini's angry one, and back again. I've nothing personal against any of you, he insisted. You're my friends, but this is my career. If only one of us can be alive at the end of this scenario, then I have to make sure that one alive is me. Why can't we just all stay alive? Cecil sighed. Band together or something, just the five of us. A passing grade split 5 ways still has to count for something. Yeah, Westbelt said. Wouldn't they rather have 5 cadets who are good survivors than just one? I don't think it works that way, Chekhov admitted. If one of us doesn't win, then none of us does. They never said that, Cecil pointed out. Chekhov shrugged. They never said that they would split the grade either. Cecil ran his hands along the top of the terminal, making the gray and white box spin lazily. So where does that leave us? The way I see it, Cantini said, our buddy, the Berserker, he hooked a thumb in Chekhov's direction, sees it as his duty to either kill us or die. The rest of us are willing to take the chance on a split grade. So let's kill him and get it over with. Cecil looked at Chekhov. The smaller Russian man shrugged. I don't want to argue with you, Chekhov said, but I don't want to lose either. You set the ground rules, Cecil told him. Chekhov nodded. I guess I did. Cecil spun the terminal one last time, then turned his back on the rest of them, as though washing his hands of the situation. Then do it, he instructed Cantini. I still want to get into the system. Robert! Chekhov slipped his finger through the loop up his sleeve just as Cecil stopped to face him. I really do understand your choice, and it's nothing personal. He hoped Cecil would remember that when this was all over. Cecil's face softened into a faint smile. No, he said softly, it's nothing personal. Before Cecil turned away again, Chekhov tugged once on the hidden trigger. He didn't even have a chance to notice Cantini's reaction before the blast of 6 widely dispersed phasers killed them all. He awoke with a headache and muscles so stiff he could barely lift his eyelids to review his surroundings. When he did, he found himself alone in a plain storage room, lying atop a narrow fold-away in a sea of other, although empty, cots. Pushing up onto his elbows, he swung his legs carefully over the side until he could cradle his head in his hands. Then he waited for the pounding to subside and tried to remember why he was here. Memory came back quickly. He'd probably been unconscious longer than the others thanks to his proximity to the phaser fire. That no doubt accounted for his stiffness and headache as well. He'd never been stunned by a phaser before, but had a cousin who always relished passing along such horror stories at family gatherings. Chekhov smiled. He'd have something to contribute to those discussions now, if only his headache faded enough for him to stand. Voices from the next room finally piqued his interest enough to encourage movement. One hand still shielding his eyes from the light, he pushed to his feet and shuffled gingerly toward the door. The adjoining lounge was dark and vacant. The only light came from the widescreen monitor set into one wall, the same source of the distant voices. Scenes of various locations on the Aslan station passed across the screen in increments of 30 to 90 seconds, effectively displaying every square foot of the station over a period of an hour or so. Chekhov approached the view screen, studying the printed data in the lower right-hand corner. Hours, minutes, seconds, date. He wondered if they had taped the entire weekend. Excuse me. He turned, finding one of the cleanup crew poised attentively in the doorway behind him. A shuttle's loading up, sir. The tech paused, then reached around the doorway to key up the lights. Chekhov saw something like amusement and delight cross the young man's features. It's you! For the first time that weekend, Chekhov felt a whisper of fear. I beg your pardon? The tech recovered quickly. Studied politeness replaced his animated expression as he joined Chekhov at the view screen. I recognize you from the drill, he explained. I've been helping with the revival crew. Everybody you've met up with this weekend has come through here. Chekhov followed the tech's broad gesture, staring once about the abandoned lounge, then turning back to the tall screen. What's this? He asked. The tech surprised him by laughing. Video monitor, he explained. We use the security pickups to record everything that went on this weekend. Anybody killed early on in the game could sit in here and see what everybody else was doing, or review all the stuff that had happened before they died. Chekhov's headache settled deep behind his eyes as the tech leaned over to intimate, You've been a pretty popular viewing subject, my friend. He could just imagine. It was a command scenario, Chekhov stated carefully. He was amazed how thin and worn that litany was growing by now. I did what I was told, that's all. The tech shrugged. I suppose. He leaned over to switch off the monitor, then turned a sunny smile on Chekhov. Is that what you're going to tell all the rest of them? Chekhov opened his mouth, then realized he didn't have the faintest idea what to say. Struggling against panicked thoughts about Sasha, Cantini, and Cecil, he said haltingly, They knew what to expect. We're all cadets here. The tech draped an arm across his shoulders to steer him toward the door. If that's the best you've got as a defense, he said companionably, do yourself a favor and take a civilian shuttle home. This must be what it feels like to drown in liquid nitrogen, Chekhov thought as he stepped through the hatchway to the already packed shuttle. No one spoke to him as he walked the interminable distance to the only empty seat. Chekhov couldn't very well blame them. He stared out the window, not wanting to face anything living during the hours-long voyage back to Earth. The pointed silence was maddening. He felt as though he could feel his 64 classmates' angry thoughts as keenly as daggers slipped under his skin. He wanted to try and explain, to say that he was sorry. Only he wasn't. Not really. He was sorry that they were angry, and sorry that he was going to have to pay the price for their lack of understanding, but that didn't change what he did. Maybe this was the difference between line officers and desk men, he thought, not without some rancor. The ability to do what's necessary without needing to place blame. Everyone was so ready to condemn him because he had acted quickly, decisively, but no one seemed willing to offer suggestions for what should have been done instead. They all thought exactly the same way. Run and hide, protect what you have, don't try to do too much, you might fail, and end up with nothing. He'd just proven that an officer's response to a threatening situation was not limited to passive defense, and they all hated him because he acted outside their ability. Too bad. They would still be complaining about the unfairness of it all long after he was assigned to a starship and gone from their petty little world. Chekhov crossed his arms in a gesture of angry defiance and sat back in his seat to watch the shuttle deberth. 40 minutes into the flight, however, some of his hauteur began to fade. The oppressive silence weighed on his spirit like a dead comrade, and Kramer had come to stand, equally uncommunicative, at the front of the aisle. Chekhov stared resolutely out his window, but started to consider apologizing again. I take it, Kramer began, as though he'd only just arrived on the scene, that none of you is terribly pleased with the outcome of this maneuver. A discontented growl boiled from the rear of the shuttle forward. Kramer smiled. What do you perceive to be the problem? Without hesitation, Cantini offered. Chekhov! Another chorus of growls indicated mass agreement. Chekhov clenched his teeth, pretending to ignore them. Do you have a comment on that, Ensign Chekhov? He hated Kramer more intensely than he had ever hated the man before, but didn't turn away from his window. They're a bunch of children, he wanted to say. Instead, he stated simply, No, sir, I have no comment. None? Kramer frowned faintly, his eyes bright and attentive. Cadet Chekhov, I'm disappointed. If he meant it to be cutting, his tone of voice failed him. What about someone else? Chekhov knew the cadets must be bursting with complaints and arguments, but no one volunteered. He didn't care, not anymore. He thought perhaps if he told himself that often enough, he'd believe it by the time they reached home. "Very well," Kramer continued. "Then we shall start with my evaluations on your performances." Chekhov feigned enough disinterest to make himself feel better about turning to look at the Commodore. Kramer waited until everyone's attention was on him before announcing, "You all failed." "What?" Chekhov wasn't the only one to ask the question aloud. He assumed that was why no one turned to scowl at him for speaking. "What the hell did you want?" Bosch demanded. "We didn't all do the same thing." "Some of us," another cadet injected, "didn't even kill anybody." Kramer stood, unmoving, at the front of the shuttle, not even raising his hands to signal for silence. "Nor did any of you," he told them sternly. "React appropriately to the situation presented." No one interrupted him. "Cadet Nabuda," he summoned. "Explain the objective of the Aslan scenario." Nabuda frowned, glancing to her left and right as though hoping to gain some insight from her classmates. "We were to stay alive," she said finally, "to avoid being killed." "I see." Kramer looked from one bewildered face to the next, his gaze resting on Chekhov's, only long enough for the ensign to understand that he'd been noted. "I needn't ask to know that is what you all believe. I observed enough ambushing and booby-trapping this weekend to know how you were thinking." "Chekhov was the only one setting traps." Chekhov twisted in his seat to face the speaker, alarmed and injured by the bitterness in her words. Sasha kept her eyes pointedly locked on Kramer, not even acknowledging Chekhov's attention with a scowl. He felt his heart melt within him. "He was merely the most creative killer among you. None of you really understood the difference between self-defense and command." Kramer crossed his arms and leaned back against the bulkhead. "Many years ago, this same exercise was performed with a class of cadets on an abandoned lunar base. They were told the same things as you, that they were being hunted, they must survive. Unlike you, however, they had among them a very creative officer who commanded in the situation instead of merely preserving himself. The officer in question inferred correctly that it made no difference if 1 or 100 cadets survived the scenario. What mattered was avoiding the assassin. He secured one of the dining halls and began drafting a security force to guard the entrances. Anyone who wished to enter had to surrender their weapons. They were then guarded by a handful of cadets already known to be trustworthy. In that manner, the scenario concluded without a single casualty, and that student received a high passing grade." Kramer looked down the aisle at Chekhov again. "Would you care to hypothesize as to that cadet's identity, Cadet Chekhov?" Chekhov shook his head, strangling with shame. It was Cecil who spoke the name. "James Kirk." Kramer nodded. "Command is not a picture drawn in black and white," he told him gently. "Not a game that one can win or lose, depending upon one's decisions. Command is an ongoing struggle. In it, you strive to maintain, not win. In the real world, no one is keeping score. I think Mr. Chekhov can tell you that winning and not losing are not necessarily the same thing." No one said anything after that. Chekhov folded his hands tight in his lap and watched the stars from his window. All his hopes for a brilliant Starfleet career floundered at his feet like dying birds, killed by the realization that he could never hope to live up to the standard James Kirk had set in both Starfleet and Chekhov's own life. The realization that Kirk would be ashamed of Chekhov and everything Chekhov had accomplished in the past 48 hours. When the shuttle bumped gently to ground several hours later, the coral pink streamers of sunrise were just caressing the eastern horizon. Chekhov stayed in his seat, staring out at the pitted, blasted landing pad as the others filed silently past him. He glanced up only once, to watch Sasha walk away from him, as though he meant nothing to her and never had. For a moment, he thought he might cry. "So you want to get breakfast?" Chekhov closed his eyes, not wanting to face anyone, even Cecil, just yet. "I'm not hungry," he said softly. Cecil sat down beside him. "I am. Want to keep me company?" "No." The last of the footsteps retreated to faint, sharp echoes on the slab work outside. Chekhov felt Cecil shift in his seat, then the computer tech said stiffly, "Boy, are you a poor sport or what?" Chekhov laughed without humor. My career is destroyed in a single weekend, and you expect me to be gracious? You overreact, Cecil scoffed. Nobody's going to boot you out of Starfleet for booby-trapping a scenario. You don't understand. Sure I do. Cecil caught his shoulder and turned Chekhov about to face him. We all screwed up, he said simply. I get the impression that's the actual point of these scenarios. We get to do it here, so we don't do it in real life. Kramer even said your Captain Kirk is the only one who didn't flunk the damn thing. The very mention of Kirk's name wrung his heart with despair. I should have known better, he insisted. I thought I had the right to serve under him, but I don't know anything. He took Cecil's shoulders. I'm sorry, Robert. I know what I was thinking, only I don't know. Not now. It just doesn't make sense anymore. He turned away to the window again. I feel like such a fool. They've given fool starship commands before, Cecil tried to console him. They gave out commands before Kirk came along. They can't break the tradition now. Chekhov smiled ruefully and sat back in his seat. If they ever give me a command, I want you to be my executive officer, to keep me from getting beyond myself like this, to keep me from being stupid. Cecil shrugged, flushing with pleasure. After this weekend, he allowed, I don't think you'll need as much reminding. So, he stood and offered Chekhov a hand up. Do you want to discuss my future vacation pay over breakfast? Chekhov stood as well, groaning at the very thought of facing the others so soon after his embarrassment. I can't. If they don't kill me, I'll have to kill myself. Laughing, Cecil headed for the hatch. Okay, he acquiesced. We'll get civvy food. More carbohydrates, more energy. He leapt out onto the landing ground with ridiculous enthusiasm. We'll need energy, he assured Chekhov fervently. We're going to be heroes! Chekhov stepped down more sedately. Cecil's face held such an expression of trust. Chekhov didn't know how to tell him that he feared all that trust misplaced. Harvey? I'd forgotten. Cecil slipped an arm around his friend's shoulders and smiled. I know what you are, he said serenely. I've always known, and I never forget.